History BFI Theme 3 Economic, Political, and Social Challenges from 1970 to 1991.
Chapter 2 France and Britain in the 1980s. Two economic models and two societies in evolution. Part 1. Britain from 1979 to 1990. Thatcherism marked a decisive break from the post-war consensus that had shaped British politics and economics since 1945. It introduced a radical reorientation of policy, dismantling the established framework of state intervention, strong trade unionism, and welfare state expansion. Margaret Thatcher rejected the idea of a managed economy and state-led social provision in favor of free market principles, individual responsibility, and reduced government influence. As she reflected in her memoirs, the Labour Party gloried in planning, regulation, controls, and subsidies. The Tory party never tried seriously to reverse it, until her government. Thatcherism thus not only redefined the Conservative Party's platform, but reshaped British society itself. The expression Iron Lady originated from a Soviet journalist in 1976 when she took the lead of the British Conservative Party. Though meant to criticize her, Thatcher embraced it, turning it into a symbol of her firmness, determination, and uncompromising leadership style. At the outset of her premiership, Margaret Thatcher prioritized the fight against inflation, which she considered Britain's most pressing economic challenge. To address it, her government embraced monetarism, an economic theory most associated with Milton Friedman and the Hayekian views on state intervention. Monetarism argued that inflation stemmed primarily from excessive government spending and an uncontrolled money supply. The Thatcher government responded by slashing public expenditure, such as cutting grants to local councils in the 1979 budget, and maintaining high interest rates to strengthen the pound on international markets. This strategy initially led to a surge in inflation, which peaked in 1980 at around 18%, before gradually falling to approximately 5% by 1983. While inflation was eventually brought under control, the early years of Thatcher's monetarist policy saw rising prices and deep economic pain. However, the consequences of this economic shock therapy were severe. Unemployment soared, reaching 3 million by 1982, and Thatcher made clear she saw this as a necessary price to pay to bring inflation under control. She believed the shift away from traditional industries and employment patterns was part of a vital modernizing process. Yet the human cost was high, particularly in industrial towns and cities, and social unrest followed. In 1981, major urban riots erupted, most notably in Brixton, South London. Despite the economic downturn and rising joblessness, the economy was partially stabilized by revenues from North Sea oil, which helped Britain avoid a balance of payments crisis and cushioned the worst effects of stagflation. Nevertheless, by 1982, Thatcher had become one of the most unpopular prime ministers in British history, with her approval ratings plunging to just 27% in public opinion polls. The Falklands War also proved a critical moment in Margaret Thatcher's premiership, allowing her to emerge as a resolute and commanding wartime leader. The long-standing dispute over the sovereignty of the Falkland Islands culminated on 2 April 1982, when Argentina's military junta ordered the invasion and swiftly overwhelmed the small British garrison stationed there. Thatcher, rejecting UN mediation, insisted that the matter be resolved exclusively by Britain, and launched a naval task force to retake the islands. By June, Argentina had surrendered, and Britain had secured a significant military and political victory. The war had far-reaching consequences for both domestic and international perceptions of Thatcher's leadership. Her determination drew comparisons with Churchill, as she was seen to have restored national pride at a time when Britain's global influence seemed to be in irreversible decline. The phrase, "the empire strikes back," captured the patriotic fervor that swept the country, contrasting sharply with the pessimism of the 1970s. The successful campaign also strengthened the UK's special relationship with the United States, particularly through the use of American bases. Politically, the victory transformed Thatcher's fortunes. Previously one of the most unpopular prime ministers in modern times, she now experienced a dramatic surge in popularity. The press rallied behind her, conservative grassroots activists were energized, and even some traditional Labour voters shifted their support. This surge in nationalistic sentiment and personal approval provided the momentum for her decisive victory in the 1983 general election. The Falklands War not only bolstered Thatcher's self-confidence and authority within her party, but also reinforced her image as a leader capable of decisive action on the world stage. A further dimension of the period concerned the government's relationship with the trade unions and its efforts to reform industrial relations. Indeed, known of the central aims of Thatcher's domestic agenda was to reduce the influence of trade unions, particularly the powerful National Union of Mine Workers, NUM, led by the militant Arthur Scargill. Early on, the government introduced legislation in 1982 that required strike ballots and banned mass picketing, making it harder for unions to mobilize industrial action. At the same time, the government built up coal reserves and relied on energy from the North Sea, preparing itself to avoid a repeat of the 1973 three-day week. The most significant showdown came during the miners' strike from March 1984 to March 1985. The government argued that the coal industry was outdated and losing money, requiring large public subsidies. Ian McGregor, head of the National Coal Board and known for his tough approach in the U.S., was brought in to oversee pit closures. While the immediate plan targeted around 20 pits, a leaked internal document suggested a long-term aim of closing up to 173 mines, threatening as many as 187,000 jobs. The NUM resisted fiercely. Scargill claimed that with the right investment, British coal had a future. But this was also about more than money. In coalfield regions like South Wales and Yorkshire, mining was part of community identity. Pit closures risked destroying entire towns. The strike turned violent at times. A defining moment came at the Battle of Orgreave in June 1984, where thousands of miners clashed with police in riot gear. The scale and aggression of the police response shocked many, and confidence in the police was shaken, particularly in working-class areas. In the end, the strike failed. The pits closed and union power was broken. While many praised Thatcher for standing firm and bringing modernization, the social cost was enormous. Entire communities were devastated, deepening the North-South divide. Politically, the crisis cemented Thatcher's authority. Her firm leadership stood in sharp contrast to the indecisive responses of past leaders like Heath or Callaghan. Public opinion was largely behind her. 65% supported the government and police. Union membership declined sharply after 1984, and the NUM was left divided and weakened. The miners' strike became a defining moment of Thatcher's time in office. It changed Britain's economic landscape and marked the decline of traditional union power for decades to come. A further dimension of the period concerned the government's economic policy, marked by a return to free market principles, supply-side reforms, and a reduction of state intervention. Margaret Thatcher's economic philosophy centered on the belief that the state had become too large and too involved in people's lives. She sought to take government off the backs of the people by curbing state control over the economy and restoring free market principles. Her key adversary in this battle was the idea of the state-run economy and overregulation. The free market is an economic system in which supply and demand determine prices and production, with minimal government intervention. Thatcher believed that economic efficiency and individual freedom would thrive in such a system. One of her first priorities was to cut what she saw as wasteful government spending, especially on welfare. This was part of a broader effort to reduce the public sector borrowing requirement, PSBR, the amount the government needed to borrow to fund its spending. A high PSBR was seen as a sign of economic irresponsibility and a threat to inflation control. Reducing it became a key target of Thatcher's monetarist agenda. Thatcher's approach drew heavily on supply-side economics, which emphasized incentivizing production and investment through tax cuts and deregulation. This led to a reduction in direct income taxes, but also to a rise in indirect taxes, such as VAT, national insurance contributions, and local rates, meaning that while the tax burden shifted, it did not necessarily decrease for everyone. Privatization was one of the most visible and radical aspects of Thatcher's economic agenda. This involved selling nationalized industries to private investors, with the twin goals of increasing efficiency and encouraging popular capitalism, widening the ownership of shares among ordinary people. Between 1979 and 1990, the number of shareholders in the UK rose from 3 to 9 million. Privatization was driven by the idea that public sector industries were inefficient and overly reliant on taxpayer money. As Thatcher famously declared, "Private good, public bad." Over 50 state-owned enterprises were sold, including major firms like British Telecom, 1984, British Gas, 1986, British Airways, 1987, and Rolls-Royce, 1987. To ensure wide participation, shares were often sold cheaply. One of the most iconic examples was the 1986 Tell Sid campaign, which promoted the sale of British Gas shares to ordinary citizens. It encouraged people who had never owned shares before to become small-scale investors, a move designed to build a culture of popular capitalism, though critics argued it masked the fact that wealth was still concentrated among the already wealthy. As a result, government revenue from privatization rose dramatically, from £377 million in 1979, 80 to £7 billion by 1988-89. Though the early years of these reforms were marked by economic hardship, privatization and deregulation helped lay the foundations for Britain's economic recovery by the late 1980s, turning the City of London into a global financial powerhouse. Alongside its economic reforms, the government also undertook a significant reshaping of local government and its relationship with labor-led councils. Thatcher turned her attention to local government, especially targeting what she saw as wasteful and ideologically driven left-wing councils. These local authorities were often accused of overspending and resisting her national policies, becoming symbolic of the kind of state inefficiency she wanted to dismantle. The economy was a major source of pressure. By 1990, inflation had climbed again to nearly 11%, although it remained lower than the levels inherited in 1979. The effects of the 1987 stock market crash were also being felt, raising fears about economic instability. As living costs rose and the benefits of Thatcher's reforms appeared unevenly distributed, public discontent grew. The poll tax controversy was the tipping point. Introduced in 1990, the community charge, popularly known as the poll tax, was designed to make local taxation fairer by charging everyone the same, regardless of property value. However, it was deeply unpopular and seen as unjust. It sparked mass protests, including a major demonstration in London, attended by 200,000 people, that descended into riots, leaving hundreds injured. The policy alienated not only the public, but also many within the Conservative Party and the press. As disapproval spread, it gave Thatcher's opponents a clear rallying point. Thatcher's leadership style also caused unrest within her own party. Over the years, her increasingly authoritarian approach had pushed many once loyal MPs to the sidelines. Among those who felt increasingly marginalized were the so-called wets, moderate conservatives who had always been uneasy with Thatcher's hardline economic policies and combative leadership style. This approach became known as conviction politics, a leadership style grounded in firm ideological beliefs rather than consensus building or political compromise. Many had been replaced or silenced by dries, Thatcher's firm ideological allies who shared her vision of economic liberalization and reduced state power. A crucial moment came in 1990 when Geoffrey Howe, a senior minister and longtime ally, resigned in protest at her hardline stance on Europe. His resignation speech, broadcast live on television, was a thinly veiled attack on Thatcher's leadership. It struck a powerful chord with many in the party, especially those uncomfortable with her combative opposition to deeper European integration, as voiced in her famous 1988 Bruges speech. The final blow came from within the Conservative Party itself. Sensing electoral defeat if Thatcher remained leader, her rivals moved against her. Michael Heseltine, a prominent conservative, launched a leadership challenge. Although she won the first round, the scale of the rebellion was clear. She had lost the support of 2/5 of her MPs. After consulting her cabinet and realizing she could no longer rely on their full backing, Thatcher reluctantly agreed to step down. Her parting words reflected the bitterness of her exit. "It is something I will never forget and never forgive." Thatcher's resignation marked the end of an era. Loved and loathed in equal measure, her legacy would continue to shape British politics long after she left office. These political and economic transformations were accompanied by profound changes in British society, marked by a growing emphasis on individualism and by deepening social divisions. Thatcher's economic policies profoundly reshaped British society, steering it away from collectivism towards a more individualist ethos. Her famous assertion in 1987 that There is no such thing as society. There are individual men and women, and there are families, captured this shift. Central to her approach was the belief that individuals, not the state, should take responsibility for their own lives. However, the social consequences were stark. The top rate of income tax was reduced, benefiting the wealthiest, while indirect taxes such as VAT and national insurance increased, disproportionately affecting the poor. Child benefit payments were frozen, limiting support for families, particularly women. Cuts in government expenditure aimed at controlling inflation also meant less funding for welfare and public services. The privatization of state-owned industries led to widespread job losses and economic insecurity, especially in regions reliant on heavy industry. As traditional industries declined, youth unemployment surged, contributing to a sense of disaffection and social alienation. The result was a widening gap between rich and poor, and a sense of fragmentation across many communities. Beyond the immediate transformations of the 1979 to 1990 period, Thatcherism also left a lasting imprint on British politics, not only economically, but politically and ideologically. It marked a clear break from the post-war consensus that had prioritized state intervention, welfare expansion, and social partnership. For supporters, Thatcherism brought modernization, efficiency, and a renewed sense of national purpose. For critics, it fostered inequality, undermined social cohesion, and weakened the role of the state in protecting vulnerable groups. Either way, it transformed the political landscape of Britain and continued to influence government policy long after Thatcher left office. Part 2. France, from 1981 to 1988. In 1981, François Mitterrand was elected president of the French Republic, leading a broad alliance of left-wing parties that had come together around the common programme commun, of the 1970s. His presidency is most prominently remembered for the abolition of the death penalty, a landmark reform championed by the esteemed and influential statesman Robert Badinter. It also embraced progressive social change by decriminalizing homosexuality. Furthermore, its presidency liberalized the media landscape by authorizing local private radio stations and supporting the creation of France's first private television channels, including Canal+. He also implemented a policy of regularizing undocumented migrants who could prove employment, and passed legislation promoting wage equality between men and women. Ultimately, François Mitterrand's cultural policy was both ambitious and emblematic, reflecting a profound commitment to culture as a cornerstone of national identity and soft power. By allocating 1% of the national budget to cultural initiatives, his administration launched transformative projects, such as the Fête de la Musique in 1982, a nationwide celebration of music that later gained international reach. He also commissioned iconic architectural landmarks like the Louvre Pyramid and the Grande Arche at La Défense, symbolizing France's modernization. Additionally, the introduction of a fixed book price law safeguarded independent booksellers and fostered literary diversity. These policies not only democratized cultural access, but also elevated France's global prestige, reinforcing its status as a beacon of artistic and intellectual excellence. At the heart of this 1981 program was a commitment to reassert the role of the state in managing the economy in response to the ongoing economic crisis. This meant adopting a Keynesian approach, stimulating demand through public spending in order to boost consumption and growth. Indeed, a historic shift in power. In May 1981, François Mitterrand defeated the incumbent president, Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, becoming the first socialist president under the Fifth Republic. This marked a historic political shift, known in France as l'alternance, whereby political power changed hands between opposing ideological camps, in this case, from the right to the left. The legislative elections that followed further reinforced this transformation. The left, led by the Socialist Party, PS, secured an absolute majority in the National Assembly. This gave Mitterrand the political space to implement his ambitious reform agenda and attempt to bring socialism to power within the institutions of the Republic. Following the left's electoral victory in 1981, President Mitterrand was in a position to implement his ambitious political program, notably through the appointment of Pierre Mauroy as Prime Minister, 1981 to 1984. At the heart of this agenda were the 110 propositions of the Socialist Party. It was a political platform promising to change life and marking a deliberate rupture with the economic and social policies of previous governments. The state was to play a central role in this vision, with an expanded welfare state and a planned economy. Key measures included the nationalization of major banks, such as BNP Paribas, and several key industrial groups, including Dassault Aviation in the military sector. These nationalizations were a clear expression of socialist economic policy, intended to shift control from the private to the public sector. Alongside this, a new wealth tax was introduced, and the minimum wage was increased by 10%. Working conditions were also reformed. The legal working week was reduced from 40 to 39 hours. The retirement age was lowered to 60, and a fifth week of paid holiday was introduced. Social benefits, including family and housing allowances, were raised by 25%. The government led by Pierre Mauroy also regularized the status of undocumented foreign workers able to prove their employment, and established legislation for pay equality between men and women in the workplace. Mitterrand's first years in office were marked by ambitious reforms that reflected this vision. However, by 1983, facing a deteriorating economic situation, the government shifted its priorities. The economic crisis and pressure from financial markets forced a change of course, known as the tournant de la rigueur, a turn towards austerity. From this point, Mitterrand's presidency increasingly moved in a more liberal economic direction, culminating in the political compromise of cohabitation. This U-turn was not ideological, but rather imposed by a series of constraints operating at different levels. On a global scale, the aftermath of the two oil shocks had triggered a sustained economic crisis, marked by stagnation and rising unemployment, a period later described by economist Nicolas Bavarez as les 20 piteux, the 20 pitiful years, covering 1975 to 1995. This era stood in stark contrast to the prosperity of the post-war Trente Glorieuses and forced many governments to abandon Keynesian strategies. At the European level, France's participation in the European Monetary System, EMS, placed pressure on the government to maintain the parity between the franc and the West German mark. This required controlling inflation and avoiding devaluation, pushing France to abandon expansionary policies that risked monetary instability. Domestically, the situation had become unsustainable. Capital flight increased as wealthy individuals and businesses moved their assets abroad. The budget deficit widened, inflation accelerated, and economic growth remained weak, hovering around just 1%. As a result, unemployment continued to rise, from 1.5 million in 1981 to 2.2 million by 1988. Increasing from around 7% in 1981 to nearly 10% by 1988. France's Keynesian stimulus program stood in opposition to the emerging global economic order, which by the early 1980s was shifting towards neoliberalism, as exemplified by the policies of Margaret Thatcher in the UK and Ronald Reagan in the US. In this international context, investors turned away from France's interventionist approach and towards countries perceived as more business-friendly. The resulting lack of investment capital, combined with the undercapitalization of recently nationalized industries, led to underinvestment, preventing the French economy from achieving the rebound that the initial stimulus had hoped to deliver. A turn towards liberalism, the end of Keynesian ambitions. Faced with mounting economic pressures and the constraints of European integration, the French government in 1983 found itself at a crossroads. It had to choose between leaving the European Economic Community's monetary framework or adopting a policy of austerity to stabilize the franc within the European Monetary System, EMS. The decision was to remain within the EMS, which meant embracing a new economic direction. The objectives of this shift were clear: to bring inflation under control and reduce the public deficit. This entailed a series of measures aligned with monetarist thinking, including significant reductions in public spending, a freeze on wages, and an increase in fuel taxes. In parallel, the government initiated a cautious move towards privatization and partially deregulated financial markets, steps that signaled a departure from the more interventionist economic stance of earlier years. Strikingly, it was a socialist-communist coalition that implemented this partial abandonment of Keynesian economics in favor of a more market-oriented, neoliberal approach. For many on the left, this was seen as a betrayal of the ideals that had brought Mitterrand to power. The austerity measures alienated a large section of the Socialist Party's traditional base, leading to growing disillusionment and a decline in support from left-wing voters. A new political balance. By 1986, the French left had become deeply unpopular, primarily due to the economic austerity measures introduced since 1983. In the legislative elections that year, the right regained political dominance, securing an absolute majority in the National Assembly. As a result, President François Mitterrand was constitutionally obliged to appoint a prime minister from the new parliamentary majority. He chose Jacques Chirac, the leader of the conservative RPR, Rally for the Republic. This marked the beginning of the first cohabitation under the Fifth Republic. Cohabitation refers to a political situation in which the president and the prime minister come from opposing ideological camps, in this case, a socialist president and a right-wing prime minister. It represented a major institutional test for the semi-presidential system established in 1958, challenging conventional notions of executive power in the French Republic. During this period, political leadership and policy direction shifted towards the liberal right. While Mitterrand retained control over foreign policy and defense, domestic and economic policy largely came under Chirac's authority. This new arrangement reinforced the liberal economic direction that had begun in 1983, with continued deregulation and the resumption of privatization efforts, symbolizing the enduring influence of market-oriented reforms, even under a divided executive. During this period, political leadership and policy direction shifted towards the liberal right. While Mitterrand retained control over foreign policy and defense, domestic and economic policy largely came under Chirac's authority. This new arrangement reinforced the liberal economic direction that had begun in 1983, with continued deregulation and the resumption of privatization efforts, symbolizing the enduring influence of market-oriented reforms, even under a divided executive. One key pillar of this approach was the adoption of new public management, a concept borrowed from neoliberal theory. It sought to make public services more efficient and less costly by introducing management practices from the private sector. This entailed cutting back state spending and shifting towards a results-driven logic in the administration of public services. The government also relaunched a sweeping program of privatizations, including high-profile firms such as TF1 and major financial institutions like BNP Paribas and Société Générale. These sales raised approximately 26 billion euros, signaling a clear departure from the nationalization policies of the early Mitterrand years. Other significant reforms included the abolition of the administrative authorization required for redundancies, making it easier for companies to lay off workers, and the elimination of the wealth tax. Additionally, the government ended price controls, further liberalizing the economy. These moves sparked widespread resistance, especially from trade unions and left-wing parties. Yet, despite the tensions, the political backlash ultimately worked in Mitterrand's favor. Capitalizing on the discontent, he was re-elected president in 1988, defeating Jacques Chirac with 54% of the vote. His victory marked the end of the first cohabitation and the beginning of a new political phase. On the international stage, Mitterrand made the Franco-German partnership a cornerstone of his foreign policy. This commitment reached its most iconic expression on 22 September 1984 at the Douaumont ossuary near Verdun. During a ceremony commemorating the dead of both world wars, Mitterrand spontaneously took Kohl's right hand in his left, surprising the chancellor, as La Marseillaise played following the German national anthem. The gesture also carried a dimension of symbolic reparation. A few months earlier, Kohl had not been invited to the ceremonies marking the 40th anniversary of the Normandy landings. The photograph of the two leaders hand in hand made front pages around the world, embodying the long journey traveled by France, Germany, and Europe since 1945. Mitterrand's foreign policy was not without its darker episodes. On 10 July 1985, the French Secret Services sabotaged the Greenpeace flagship in the port of Auckland, New Zealand, where it was preparing to sail to Mururoa to protest against French nuclear tests in the Pacific. 2 bombs were planted on the hull. The second explosion killed Fernando Pereira, a photographer trapped below deck. According to Admiral Lacoste, director of the DGSE, the operation had been carried out with the explicit authorization of President Mitterrand. Defense Minister Charles Ernoult was forced to resign, and Prime Minister Fabius publicly acknowledged French responsibility on 22 September 1985. Mitterrand's relationship with the Eastern Bloc was shaped by caution rather than boldness. When General Jaruzelski declared martial law in Poland in December 1981, crushing the Solidarność movement, Mitterrand's government did protest, but quickly made clear it did not want to push the matter further, prioritizing the stability of East-West relations over open support for the Polish opposition. As communist regimes collapsed in 1989, his instinct was to manage the transition carefully rather than celebrate it. Fearing that the breakup of the Soviet Union could unleash dangerous nationalisms, he seemed reluctant to let go of the idea of a reformed USSR as a stabilizing partner in Europe, going so far as to appear during the August 1991 coup against Gorbachev to initially recognize the hardline plotters. This reserved stance towards the liberation of Eastern Europe remains one of the most debated aspects of his legacy. Mitterrand's relationships with Reagan and Thatcher were complex, defying simple ideological alignments. Despite being a socialist president, Mitterrand firmly supported the deployment of American Pershing missiles in Western Europe in 1983, arguing that only a balance of forces could guarantee peace on the continent. Reagan personally expressed his admiration for this stance, saying it strengthened the Atlantic Alliance. With Thatcher, the relationship was equally surprising. Although everything seemed to oppose them politically, their working relationship quickly became one of genuine mutual respect, and together they saw through the long-standing project of the Channel Tunnel, inaugurated on 6 May 1994. Yet differences remained. Both Mitterrand and Thatcher immediately recognized that Gorbachev's arrival in power in 1985 marked a turning point, faster than either Reagan or Kohl did. Overall, Mitterrand navigated his alliances pragmatically, maintaining France's strategic independence while avoiding any isolation on the world stage.